Good afternoon. Hi. It is my pleasure to begin this conversation with my former professor. The last time I think we were seated in a similarly formal environment was for my dissertation defense. So I will say this is an extremely friendly and I think much less focused and driving conversation, maybe more expansive.
And can I just say, I'm sitting here with my former dissertation director.
That's right.
In the very front row. So this is a homecoming for me.
Things like this happen in Hyde Park, I think. So it's a great occasion for me, and I hope for all of you, to engage this book, this, I think, spectacular Technicolor production. I'm realizing that I have to be mindful of time, so I think I will start with the obligatory question, which is, how did a Shakespeare scholar move into the tawdry realm, as I have said to him before, the tawdry but delightful realm of color? So,
well, it's a wonderful question, which I've asked myself several times. Shakespeare has been very, very good to me, and so is Professor Bevington. So I feel like, why would I ever escape from that glorious Arcadian world? But an aspect that probably even David doesn't know about me is I went to college not thinking I would study literature. My parents were Depression kids, neither went to university. I somehow found myself at Princeton very much confused about what you do at an Ivy League school, and I was looking through a course catalog when there were such things as course catalogs. Now they're, of course, all online. And looking through those thousands of wonderful courses, and I saw Introduction to Painting. I thought, fabulous. You don't have to write papers, and you don't have to read books. Made perfect sense to me. And I'd always been fascinated by color. We just discovered in the green room, which was yellow, by the way, that Ellen's son, for Halloween, was Mondrian wearing the Broadway Boogie Woogie painting over his body. And I had that painting in my bedroom from the time we moved to New York when I was about 7 until I went to college. So there was always something about color that fascinated me. And I took a course from somebody who I learned later was actually a rather serious painter named Esteban Vicente, who was kind of a second-tier abstract expressionist painting, but very successful and a wonderful painter. And I loved this course. I kind of went in once a week and splashed some paint around, and he smiled at me, and I thought, this is fabulous. And then about week 4, Esteban came up to me and he said, hey, do you want to get a beer after class today? And I said, great, in those wonderful halcyon days when the drinking age was 18 and you could do this. And I thought, this is really wonderful. Here's this great painter who's somehow figured out I'm talented. And what he's going to tell me is, you know, you should just drop out of school and move to Paris and paint. And I was very, very excited about this. And we went off to a bar, and Esteban leaned forward and he said, you know, you shouldn't do this. And I tried not to cry. And then he said, which was actually incredibly thoughtful and kind. His next sentence was, and you can see how this seared into my brain because I remember it exactly. The next sentence was, well, there will always be better paintings in your head than you'll ever be able to get on a canvas. And it was true. It was just definitely true. And so I knew I could never get them on a canvas, so I worked in my medium and I got them into words. And then the only painting I ever did was actually in David Bevington's house when he moved here a long time ago, 5747 South Blackstone. So that really is the beginning. I mean, this is a book in various ways. I didn't know I was writing, but have been writing for a long time.
I find that a really helpful anecdote insofar as you use paintings to argue with in this book, right? The paintings they make a case for a way of thinking about how color hits discourse, how color hits the human imagination. But there would be a lot of other ways, I think, yes, of imagining what the evidence pool would be for this kind of a project. There could be butterflies or insects or flowers, or one turns to the natural world, I think, pretty immediately. I love the fact that you work in this medium that's already a medium, that's already an intervention into a thinking about color. Did you know that was how you would have to write the book?
I didn't know. I mean, I discovered it as I was writing, and one of the many things that's been fascinating to me working on this book is everyone's interested in color. I mean, first of all, I thought there'd be 3 people here today. This alone is staggering to me. I knew out of loyalty David would come. So it might have been only one person here. But everywhere I went, and when I was working on it, when I talked about it, I gave talks as one does. I've been doing this I've been really working on this book on and off. I wrote the wrong book first. I wrote a 350-page, very academic book about color and decided that's not the book I want to write. And so if anyone's interested in publishing that book, you can have it, and you claim it as your own. I mean, I don't want to grab this one at all. And then I realized a book on color should be organized by colors. And I realized that there were arguments in my head. And I wasn't doing, I mean, there are lots of wonderful books on color. But I was really doing something different. I mean, I sometimes thought about the book as a memoir without the me. I mean, it was about, because it's very much me thinking through these things. And the structure was always to find an argument. Rather, so many of the books on color seem to me just to be very beautiful books, giving you the images, but with no argument at all. And I knew there was an argument there, but the argument is arbitrary. Just the other day, I was doing a book event in New York City, and someone came up after who is a evolutionary biologist and started with, how much do I know about birds? And I said, almost nothing, which is my answer to most questions you'll discover after. But he told me all sorts of wonderful things. And the pleasures of this book have been how often, almost always, someone in the audience has told me something that thrilled me, interested me, I had no idea about. That was part of it. And also the wonderful advantage some of us have using academic email addresses. People tend to answer an email from yale.edu. And I wrote to everybody. I mean, as I was working on this book, I wrote to some neurobiologist at Stanford who was working on color vision in animals. And I said, I read an article of yours. I'm not sure I understood it exactly. This is what I think you said. And then I said, and if you want to tell me to go do my own research, that's okay too. I think that was the winning line. And he wrote back right away and said, oh yeah, no, this sounds really interesting. And then he said, it was a great phrase, he said, I think a neurobiologist would have said your sentence differently, which meant I was wrong, right? I mean, but it was so graceful. And then I went out to his lab for a while and watched some of his work, and it was really remarkable. But I found my own arguments. I mean, what I found when I realized the book I wanted to write was I took some of the ideas from the very boring 350-page book, which I hope one of you will publish as your own. I'll review it very positively, I promise. I was going to do 10 colors, 10 essays on 10 colors, and some idea about color would be more or less plausibly shoehorned under one of those colors or another. And that's how it worked. I mean, there were arguments there before I figured the structure out, and then I made it work, which sometimes works.
I think it's impossible not to be fascinated by the neurobiology of color, just because it's so strange that color seems to have such profound materiality, right? And it promises us this kind of correlation of our mood in the world, and yet we find that it's so astonishingly subjective, right? And it's as though it's a language for communicating, you know, the possibility of having a shared experience, a shared mood, but it's never something we can fully biologically satisfy. I love that, and I love that you venture into that really complex domain between the subjective and the objective.
Well, I think I'm pretty sure this is true. The first quotation in the book, maybe it's in the preface, but Cézanne said somewhere that color is the place where the mind and the world meet.
Right.
And that, you know, that was maybe the first idea when I started to see what kind of book I might write. And is this idea of the mind and the world meeting. And, you know, we think the obvious way to think about color in many ways wrong. I mean, we think color's out there, it's a property of things, in the same way that length or weight might be a property of things, but it's not quite that. Length and weight don't depend upon a perceiver for those things to be. Color depends upon a perceiver for color to exist. It doesn't mean it's not real, it's just a different kind of reality that's relational. And the book, to me, if it has an easy arc to describe, it's we make color and color makes us. I mean, I think that's how I thought about it from the beginning, and try to think about how both those things are true and what they might mean.
Well, this seems like a good juncture for me to invite you to read a couple pages from the very opening.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Yes.
And this doesn't disoblige you from buying the book and reading it yourself, but maybe. So, I mean, what I really do think is sort of true is that in a fundamental way, all colors are illusions. I mean, we're used to thinking about color illusions, right? You can poke your eye, don't do that too aggressively, but you start to see colors. You look at the sun, you see colors. We know about color illusions in various ways. But they all seem to be. Colors seem in some fundamental sense to be illusions, not just the illusory ones. As objective physical facts, colors are not colored. Always with color, there's something more than meets the eye. That's really what this book is about both what meets the eye and the so much more that doesn't. It's about how we see colors, about what we see or think we see, and about what we do with the colors that we recognize or imagine. It is about how we make color and how color in turn makes us. The book's structure is neither thematic nor chronological. It's topical in several senses of that word, and opportunistic. Color provides the book's principle of organization, which means, among other things, that you can read the book straight through or start with your favorite color. There are 10 chapters, and I begin by unashamedly unweaving the rainbow and following the order of its 7 constituent colors. And the book ends with 3 more on black, white, and gray, those achromatic colors which don't appear in the spectrum of visible light, but define their own independent color scale, although they appear in the spectrum of my concerns. Each chapter uses its nominal focus on a single color to explore some discrete aspect of what makes the subject of color as compelling as color is itself. Each individual color becomes, as is the way with colors generally, emblematic. In each chapter, the color functions as the focal point of a consideration of one of the various ways in which color appears and matters in our lives. A friend, clearly an academic, reading an early draft of the book, recognized that its central argument was twofold, that colors are ontologically impure, only an academic uses that word, toggling between the self and the world, and that they're figuratively promiscuous, available for almost any kind of metaphoric appropriation. That seems more or less right to me, although the adjectives impure and promiscuous seem unconsciously to import an all too familiar anti-color bias, which suspiciously views color as mere seduction. Color is indeed seductive, but it isn't mere seduction or mere anything else. It is essential to what it means for us to be human. It doesn't get much more essential than that.
That's lovely. It brings me to your chapter on yellow perils, I think, because you identify the 2 spectra of colors that you're going to be engaging here, the Newtonian rainbow and the monochromatic white to black. But in Byron Kim's painting that you address in that chapter, there's the spectrum of skin colors that he inventories in this wonderful kind of classifying but also aesthetic enterprise. And I would love to hear about what it felt like to turn to this question of color and race.
Yeah, thank you. That's, in some ways, that intellectually became one of the earliest points when I start to see what this book might be. I mean, it just occurred, we color code race with 4 colors that nobody is. Right? Nobody's white, nobody's black, nobody's red, nobody's yellow, and just I was interested in how that happened, and you could kind of trace it back to Linnaeus in the 18th century. And I started working on when did Asians first start to get perceived as yellow, and good Renaissance scholar, very well trained at UC, I started to look at the early writings, mainly of Jesuits, European Jesuits, going to China and Japan, and what they described. And over again, they say, oh, there are these people there, they're white like us. And that phrase, they're white like us, shows up in Italian, Spanish, French, English, over and over again. And nobody says, I found one Portuguese writer who says, I traveled through China, and they're white like us, but in the north, some of them are kind of yellowy. No, nobody says they're yellow. When does it happen? 19th century, probably not the first person to use the phrase, but Kaiser Wilhelm in 1895 names the yellow peril. And what he sees is a kind of clash of civilizations coming. And he commissions a painting, this astonishing painting of, on one side is Europe and these sort of Valkyrie-like Aryan women standing there looking fiercely over the expanse of the ocean at a flaming Buddha and hordes of yellow people. And even that word horde becomes so much part of this yellow peril idea. And he has the painting copied. He sends copies to every ruler in Europe and to President McKinley and says, this is the future. This is what's going to happen. This is the clash of civilization. We got to stop this. And then, of course, within 7 or 8 years of him sending these paintings out, there is a world war, but it's World War I, and it doesn't involve Asia at all. It's just the white European countries who are fighting. And so that's what started to interest me. How did this happen? And then realizing that you can tell the story about why Asians are called yellow, and you realize there's nothing to do with pigmentation, but with prejudice. Why do blacks get thought of? African Americans thought of as black, which they're not. When do American Indians be called red? And even why do white people get called white? There's an interesting narrative about that. And I saw a painting in New York, it was at the Whitney then, by this Asian American painter named Byron Kim. It's called Synecdoche. It's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. now. And it's a kind of painting you've all seen, a very abstract color field painting of tiles of color. And they're 20 by 20, 10 by 12 inch tiles. There are 400 tiles. And they're just arrayed, and every color is different. But also, it's a very narrow chromatic field, because what he was doing, he was living in Brooklyn then, and he was stopping people on the street and saying, can I paint your skin color? And it was New York, so most people said, go fuck yourself. That's a quote from Byron. But enough people said, sure, that the first 400 who did this, he would say, roll up your sleeve, and he'd paint the inside of their forearm, because it doesn't get too much sun, and usually doesn't have a lot of hair there, and he'd very quickly match their skin color with a palette that he carried with him. And then he would paint a 10 by 12 inch tile with that skin color. And then he had 400 of these. And if you go to the National Gallery and see this, there's a booklet attached to the little label of the painting, which has the name of every person who allowed him to do this. And another one of those happy stories where a Yale.edu email got an answer. So I wrote something about the painting, and I found his email address. I sent it to him. And I said, I don't know if this makes any sense to you. Are you recognizable to yourself? I think that was the phrase I used in what I wrote. And he wrote back instantly and said, wow, this is great. I don't know that I was thinking about all those things, but it seems true to me. And I'm actually going to be in New Haven next week. You want to meet for a drink? So we met, and we started to talk, and we've actually become quite good friends at this point, except I can't afford his paintings, which is too bad. But he told me that he had started really as a completely abstract color painter. He was doing just big paintings that were kind of about color. And his idea was that what a painter does in a post-photographic age is the paintings are always about painting, or at least the materials of the painting. And he just was painting color. And then he said, I'm an Asian American. Color can't be that abstract. Color can't be that removed from context, is when he first started to do this painting. And it just was, it's so smart and it's so beautiful. And yet the other thing you see when you look at this painting is every tile is different, but the chromatic range is actually so incredibly narrow, right? Because nobody's green, nobody's blue, nobody's red, nobody's purple, and nobody's yellow. I mean, everybody is kind of a more or less pinky shade of brown, depending how pinky it is, right? And so it's an incredible statement about color, about perception, about historical context, and about race. It's an amazing, amazing painting.
It gives the lie to that white-black opposition so immediately. It's a really remarkable representation. I also wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about, maybe in the context of the Indigo chapter, the sort of ecologies of like labor and industry and colonial history that get folded up in a color and become part of its desirability that really inflected so differently. I actually feel sort of ashamed that I came in deep blue now because of the way that I think about indigo, which is, I think, the lowest liar, right, in terms of the fame of the colors you investigate.
So indigo fascinated me. Once the challenge for me, sort of intellectually, once I figured out my scheme, I was going to have 10 colors and I was going to tell 10 stories that I thought were interesting. And some seemed obvious. Blue, that chapter is called Moody Blues, and I talked about color and emotion. That seemed obvious enough. Bob Dylan's Tangled Up in Blue. But, then some of them were more of a test. So I think, what am I going to do with indigo?
Right.
I was committed to the scheme, and I wasn't quite sure what I thought about it. And then I learned something interesting, is that actually nobody before Newton seemingly ever saw the color that we call indigo. And if you look at early dictionaries before the end of the 18th century, if you look up indigo, what they say, indigo is a dye that's used to color things blue. And one of the reasons that Newton needs it to be a color is he's convinced that there are 7 colors in the rainbow. Right? He's doing all these experiments where he's using prisms to break up white light and see the constituent colors. So he decides there's 7, but he doesn't decide that right away. I found this great letter he writes to the head of the Royal Society, and he says, I think there's 7 colors in the rainbow, but there might be 5, and sometimes I think I see 11. And then he writes a wonderful sentence. He says, my eyes aren't very good at discerning color. I think, like, you're the greatest color theorist in the world, and my eyes aren't good at seeing it. And then he decides there have to be 7, not because he thinks he sees 7, but because there's 7 notes in the diatonic scale, and the world was created in 7 days, and so it's really part of a belief in how the world is put together. It's part of God's creation, so there have to be 7. So he sees 7, but then he can't really make them out. He can actually only see 5. So he decides, I need 2 more, so I'll put orange kind of in here, though he's not sure he can see it when he uses his prism to cast the light on the wall. I'll put orange between red and yellow, and then I need something sort of between blue and violet. And so he says indigo, but no one until Newton had ever called indigo color. It was a dye. And then I got interested in what's the story of that dye. And like so many of the pigments and dyes, they have very complicated, often kind of noxious histories. There's the long history of the Dutch knew in the 17th century that white lead paint was poisonous, but they loved the effects of the white lead paint, so they just kept using it, though people got sick and some people died. Sheila's green, probably Napoleon died because in his room in St. Helena, he had green wallpaper painted with Sheila's green that was made from arsenic. There's the whole history of that kind of noxiousness, but indigo has a particular kind that to make the dye commercially involves such amount of human labor put under difficult conditions. And it's actually because the indigo plant doesn't release the dye. You have to do so many awful things to it. And until you could mechanize the process, you mostly had to have people sort of marching up and down in these hot tubs of where the plant is fermenting, which is just means rotting, of course. Just whether you like the byproduct or not is the difference. And people did die. George Washington gets a letter from one of his generals who's thinking about buying an indigo plantation in South Carolina, and says, it looks like you could make some money, and this is this wonderful color that's produced. On the other hand, nobody works on those plantations for more than 4 or 5 years who doesn't die. And there's a sort of comic story about William Morris, the great arts and crafts designer, being visited by a friend, and who comes to see him and knocks on the door, and Morris doesn't answer, and he opens the door and goes in and yells, William, where are you? And Morris yells out, I'm dying. Except what he was D-Y-E-I-N-G. But people were dying. And that story seemed to me, I knew I wanted to talk somewhere about just dyes and pigments, but I didn't want to go through everyone. And there's actually a wonderful book by Philip Ball called Bright Earth that talks about this. But somehow the idea that you can also be very sentimental about colors, and we all are. And here was just sort of a moment where you say, all things come with a price, and this one comes with a really heavy one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the need to manufacture the seventh color, right, then entails this history of manufacture. That's really shocking, really startling to read. I also, in the same way that I found the discussion of yellow peril and how entire cultures could be taught to see differently, I found the discussion of orange amazing, right, as a color that really needs an iteration in nature in order to show up in the language.
Yeah, so one of the topics in the wrong book, I got really interested in color names. Where do they come from? Why do we do this? And just you walk into any drugstore and you look at the names of lipsticks and fingernail polishes, and they're so bizarre. How did this happen? Actually, I saw a lipstick with the creepiest color name I ever saw. My wife says it's actually a reputable brand. And the lipstick name is Underage Red.
Oh my God.
Which you just think, oh dear, it's utterly shocking. So I started to think about color names, and most color names they come from something that is that color, right? So maroon is the French word for chestnut. Burgundy is the color of a wine. Rust is the color of rust. So most of them are an implicit adjective that's the name of something that is that color attached to a noun that then sort of gets dropped away. And then orange, I didn't have a story to tell. I was just sort of interested in what this was. And the question I asked myself, since almost all these color names came from the name of something that was that color, it seemed obvious that then orange came from this thing that was that color. And then it turns out it's not true. What's remarkable about it is there is no orange as a color name until there were oranges, which just seems utterly bizarre to me. Right? So in Old English, the word for orange is literally yellow-red. In Chaucer, in the Nun's Priest's Tale, the rooster has this, he talks about how the fox came to the hen house, and the fox was betwixt the color of yellow and red. Nobody has a word for orange. They see the color. They know what this is, this sort of something between red and yellow, but the word they have for it is betwixt red and yellow. And what happened was Portuguese traders go to India at the end of the 15th century. They see oranges. They don't know what they're called. They call them golden apples in all of their reports back. They bring them back, but they've learned what the indigenous population calls them, and the word for the orange blossom in Sanskrit and in Tamil is narang. And you can start to see what happens. In Spanish, the word is naranja, right? So that becomes the word. They bring that word narang back in both Spanish and then the early form in Italian, narantia. And then the N drops away because it got confused with an article. So actually probably the English word orange should actually be naranj, but they just dropped it off from the an before. So oranges became into, we see them as orange because of this history of trade. And then the really weird thing is, histories of trade often become global and circular. So now the modern word in Tamil for orange is actually sort of pronounced orange, but it comes from the English. So it's actually gone completely full circle. And so there was no word orange until there were oranges. But by the end of the 19th century, it was possible to forget that. So I spend probably too much time talking about that wonderful Van Gogh painting, 6 Oranges in a Basket, where it's very clear Van Gogh is painting orange, not oranges. The oranges are just the occasion to do something with color. And I compare it to a Spanish painting where the painter is clearly painting oranges. But people writing about that painting actually talk about how wonderful it is that, that the color word and the thing are the same, but obviously the orange, the fruit, came before the color. But it's not true. It's the other way around. But each of these stories is a kind of complicated story about color and context, whether it's some version of mind and world playing itself out in various particularities.
That seems like a good opportunity to talk about the crossing that you make in the last chapter of your book on gray, when you talk about, for instance, The Wizard of Oz, when we move from a black and white world into a color world and back again. And it raised for me a great desire to hear you muse further on the technology of Technicolor, which I've always found a kind of amazing representation of colorfulness detached from the way we see or the way we traditionally encounter color contrasts. So I thought I would open the door to that.
You've asked all my favorite questions. This is great. So what gray was I knew I wanted to write about black, white, and gray because I wanted those 3 achromatic colors to at least indicate there are other ways of thinking about color, and you could do other things. Computers produce color in a very different way, and that could have been a topic, but one my own technological limitations would have thwarted in some way. And it's interesting, I grew up in an age where I can still remember a black and white TV in my house, and photography, art photography, and not all photography was mostly in black and white, but art photography in particular was in black and white. Then I started to think, black and white is just actually a weird phrase for thinking about all these films, movies in black and white, photographs in black and white. I mean, because they're not. I mean, they're very rarely black or white. I mean, there's somewhere some grayscale in between those things. And zebras are black and white. Photographs are not. So this interested me, and I started to think about, one, why does this come to be the word we use for this, black and white rather than gray, which would make more sense. And I started to read about the early history of photography, where people say all the obvious things in the 19th century. This is this wonderful way to record the world as it really is, and that as it really is phrase appears over and over and over again, and it sort of doesn't occur to them, well, the one thing that isn't the way the world really is in black and white. And for so long, and some of you in this audience are old enough to remember the world where black and white successfully stood in for all the other colors. It really wasn't even problematic. We accepted that as normative. And yet very early in the history of photography, people got interested in how could you color those photographs. Hand coloring, people working cyanotypes were doing something in blue, which are quite amazing and fabulous. But nothing's really stabilized, and it really wasn't until late in the 1930s that there was even a color film that you could use, and it wasn't really stable until late 60s, early 70s. And one of the things, remember the Paul Simon song, Kodachrome? A few nods in the head. The younger ones have no idea who Paul Simon is. That's okay. But Kodachrome was a song he wrote in 1971. And he sings in the song, everything looks worse in black and white. He's so excited about this new technology that brings color to film, everything looks worse in black and white. And then there's this big concert in Central Park, I think 1982 or 1983, and he sings the song again, and I went and found a YouTube video of it to see if this is true, and it is. And he sings, "Everything looks better in black and white." And what's happened in the 10 years is black and white becomes a kind of form of nostalgia, right? And it has that effect now. You see a black and white photograph, and one of the things that does interest me is what happens. There's a comparison of two photographs in the book. One is that famous photograph which you've all seen, a WPA photograph from the Great Depression that was taken in California by Dorothea Lange called The Migrant Mother. And if you don't recognize the title, you'll absolutely recognize the picture. It's a weather-beaten mother with her arm around two children in a tent in California where they had left Oklahoma from the Dust Bowl to come to California, or at least they could live. And there's another photograph a page or two later taken by a friend of mine who's a photographer and one of the really good people in the world who sees trouble and just goes to witness. And he was on Lesbos for a long time, just helping migrants come, get off the boats from Turkey. And he took a picture of another migrant mother, but it's in full color. Another mother, beautifully composed, all of these sort of organized by those wonderful triangles, really, of the Virgin and Child paintings. You can see the iconic quality of this. And it just struck me, looking at these two photographs, that the migrant mother from the Depression, it's safely in the past. There's no politics to it anymore. There was a politics when it was taken, but now it's a great photograph. And it's been aestheticized away from politics. And Doug's photograph still makes the sort of urgency of action possible, where black and white has become a kind of sentimentality, an aestheticization of realities that maybe we shouldn't be so sentimental about. And then I started to think, you all remember some of these movies where color and black and white intersect. There's a great Wim Wenders movie about angels looking at the world in black and white, and suddenly seeing color for the first time, and then one deciding to fall. I mean, all these falls into color. Pleasantville is another one of those movies, that 1950 kids looking at a TV show and then kind of getting sucked into this world of Pleasantville, and it is so pleasant and safe. And then finally, the first sign of color in this is someone has sex and all of a sudden sees a red rose, and color gets identified with this. And then I thought about The Wizard of Oz, which is the great example, right? A 1939 movie, a Dust Bowl movie in some way, though the novel was written much earlier. And that play between the gray of Kansas and the technicolor of Oz. Can I read just a
Please do, yeah.
little bit of this? And are we getting close?
We are very close, so this will be our last gesture.
As an ending bit. So those of you who remember the story and maybe the book, in the novel, Frank Baum says, "The sun and wind had taken the sparkle from Auntie M's eyes and left them a sober gray." That's what the novel says, on which the film was based. They had taken the red from her cheeks and lips, and they were gray also. That's the way the novel describes Kansas. Gray lives lived on the great gray prairie, in a house as dull and gray as everything else, where even blades of grass, as the novel says, were burnt by the sun until they were the same gray color to be seen everywhere. It's an oppressive gray sameness, broken only when all that gray is gathered and unleashed in the tornado that transports Dorothy somewhere over the rainbow into a world of fantastic color, a world of ruby slippers and a yellow brick road that leads to the Emerald City. And nonetheless, always Dorothy wants to go home. In the novel, the Scarecrow wonders about this determination. "I cannot understand why you would wish to leave this beautiful country and go back to the dry, gray place you call Kansas," he says to her. The answer is only that Kansas is home. "No matter how dreary and gray our homes are," says Dorothy, "we people of flesh and blood would rather live there than in any other country, be it ever so beautiful. There's no place like home." Both the novel and the film work very hard to make us believe that, but maybe even Dorothy doesn't. Certainly her answer never convinces the scarecrow. Of course I cannot understand it, he says. If your heads were stuffed with straw like mine, you would probably all live in the beautiful places, and then Kansas would have no people at all. Maybe it was different in 1899 when the novel was written than in 1939 when the film came out. And some people have thought that the novel was a disguised political allegory about monetary policy. But in 1939, maybe it was not so far-fetched to see the film as a not-so-disguised allegory about the Depression, the gray landscape of the Dust Bowl giving way to the bright promise of Oz, or the only somewhat less fantastical California. And Kansas migrants did head west in great numbers in the second half of the 1930s after years of drought and dust storms, which had turned their once-green farmland gray. Over the Rainbow could be thought the anthem of all the world's migrants. But even if they sing of that place where troubles melt like lemon drops, most always still dream of going home. Dorothy doesn't choose to leave Kansas, but it wasn't really a choice for the real Kansans who did. Dorothy's unwillingly ripped from her home, however dreary and gray it may be, but the tornado, an all too familiar weather phenomenon in Kansas, is just one of the many unpredictable and irresistible forces that uproot people and set them out on perilous roads, very few of which are yellow bricked, to escape the misery that home can become. Dorothy is an unwilling migrant, almost all migrants are, who finds herself in a new land of color. But unlike almost all other migrants, Dorothy does return home. In the film, unlike the novel, she's of course never actually left it. In the film, there's no place but home. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother stayed in California, and my friend Doug's migrant family is still looking for a refuge in an increasingly unwelcoming Europe and the United States. Dorothy, however, does find herself safely back in Kansas as the film turns back to reality and back to its initial monochrome. But the Scarecrow's earlier bewilderment about why anyone would want to live in Kansas remains. It's hardly dismissed or discredited by the film's return to the bleak grayness of the Kansas plains. Gray is still the color of dust and disappointment. Although in 1939, gray was also still the usual color by which the world was represented in film and photography, the Technicolor world over the rainbow holds out a promise that we might have other lives, lived in other places, places that we might one day come to call home. But maybe not so much today. Go vote on Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we now open the floor to questions. There's a person circulating with a microphone whose attention I will get. Here we go.
I heard that in the Greek Odyssey and in those ancient works, that the color blue was never represented. Now, is that because the Greeks didn't perceive blue, or they didn't have a name for the color, or that, why is that?
That's a wonderful question, and because you have a mic, I assume everybody can hear. So did the Greeks perceive blue because none of those early texts ever use, there is a Greek word for blue, kion, but they don't use it. And every couple of years, this becomes a media meme that ancient Greeks couldn't see blue. And it's not true. And you can actually discover where it comes from. William Gladstone, who at one point was prime minister in Britain in the 19th century, was actually a great classicist, probably a less great politician. And he's the one who started this. He notices that Homer doesn't use the word blue at all in either the Odyssey or the Iliad. And he gets curious about it, and he decides it's because their visual system wasn't sufficiently developed to see this. But Gladstone is actually prime minister the same year that Darwin's first Origin of Species comes out. And it's just clear that evolutionarily it couldn't have happened this quickly. It can't be true. And what the story really is, it's about color names rather than color vision. And that is, there are lots of principles on which you can name color. Now, modern industrialized societies name color really as a kind of abstraction. Right? We see color tiles, we tell some designer we want this car to be red, we want this jacket to be orange. Color exists sort of independently for us. But for most cultures, color isn't independent of the world you live in, and there are principles other than hue that would let you identify color. And all the Greek color words are really about light. They're about radiance, things that are very radiant and things that are less radiant. And so when the phrase Homer uses, the famous one in English, gets translated as wine dark sea, but the Greek means something like wine looking sea. And you think, well, if you live near the ocean, there's a wonderful picture in the book that I took of just Santorini, just blue ocean, blue sky, and you think, of course they saw blue. I mean, you can't live where they live and not see blue. But if you live near the ocean, you realize, well, the ocean has lots of colors. Blue, if you're a 5-year-old might color the ocean blue, but your experience of the ocean at different times of day, under different weather conditions, it is everything from kind of a pale blue to almost a black. And for them, all colors had names that had to do with radiance, and they more or less were forms of shiny and not shiny as they work. So it doesn't appear there, but it has nothing to do with their color vision, how it works. And I talked to some anthropologists who were doing work with people who work in South Sea Islands. And there are a couple of them that really have had very few visitors, other than occasional visitors from the Australian government who don't care very much. And these 2 Danish researchers were working on this, and they brought a whole bunch of colored chips to see what words they use. And in the first time when they got people to talk about this, someone said, well, we don't talk much about color on this island. And that's the name of the famous article they wrote, We Don't Talk Much About Color. And then they go on to say, well, they don't discriminate colors very carefully, which turns out, even you read their article, it turns out to be wrong. I mean, they make incredible discrimination. So they have a word for red, which is the color of your teeth when you chew betel nuts. They have words for the color of your eyes if you drank too much alcohol, the color of the sun in the morning before it rises over some hill. So they have these complicated words for color, but they're all contextual. I was giving some lectures in Hungary, and one of those great moments when someone asked a really smart question and then told me something I didn't know, a person said, do you realize that there are 2 words for red in Hungarian? And I said, I didn't know them, but there are lots of words for red in English and other language. And he said, oh, no. In most languages, if there are multiple words, they're marking chromatic differences, right? There's a dark red and there's a light red and some word for things in between. Russian has 2 words and 2 colors for light blue and red blue, and dark blue. Those are actually, Russians see those as 2 different colors, but they're still chromatic. Hungarian, there are 2 words, piros and vörös. And piros is kind of a happy red. So if a child has a ball and it's any color from pink to burgundy, it's always piros. Easter egg, whether it's pink or dark red, always piros. The Soviet flag, vörös, which you gotta love that. That never became piros. So the blood is vörös, the dangerous red, but a burgundy wine is piros. So for them, at least that color gets marked sort of emotionally rather than chromatically, which just seemed utterly amazing to me. But then I started to think about it, and then that's when I started to contact anthropologists, and they said, oh yeah, now this happens sort of all over the world. It's only sort of modern industrialized countries that have this notion that the color that we see relates to this abstraction of a color that we can imagine. And he said, the whole history of that. And so I think the answer is, when Greeks saw color, there was no need. When your 2 major ways of seeing blue were the sky and the ocean, neither of which is stable, why would you need a word blue? And they don't.
And we have time for just one more question.
Good segue to what I was thinking about just now. One of my favorite colors is blue, but why do we call music the blues? Which doesn't make me happy.
Right. Good, great question. And I do write about this a bit, and I think what happens is, blue is my favorite color too, by the way, and what I love about it, it can go from almost white to almost black. The range of things that we accumulate under the idea of blue. And you start to get people talking about the blues as despair and depression. Really, you can find it in the 18th century. It starts to show up, and I think it actually goes back to a medical phenomenon. And I think it's the phenomenon of the blue baby, that sense of when you can't oxygenate your blood enough, and even at moments of death, lips will turn blue, fingertips will turn blue. So I think the relationship of blue and depression and melancholy and despair comes from an actual observable biological fact. But there are these other blues in the world, those highly saturated blues, the blues of transcendence. The description in Genesis of the bottom of heaven is blue and sapphire, Vishnu. I mean, how many religions use blue as a color of hope and transcendence? So I think all colors have a sort of symbolic range that's unstable and contradictory. I think that's true of just every color, but no more so than with blue. And the blues just seems like a wonderful place to think about this, that sort of space between despair, but also the singing itself. The Mississippi Delta ex-slaves, or even some slaves still, singing these songs, just a source of hope and an expression of their lives matter, and then moving north into Chicago, Rush Street, Memphis, all these places. And it's even double even with the blues. I mean, for all the despair, you listen to a great blues guitarist, and there's hope and creativity and genius. And both become true with blue. And in the book, it goes from thinking about, I think I do use the Dylan line, tangled up in blue, this is what happens, but it goes from Picasso's blue period paintings, which are really the blues of depression, through Yves Klein's remarkable, fully saturated, gorgeous blues, and his kind of self-performance. And then it ends with an amazing film by Derek Jarman, which was just called Blue. And Jarman is, people in America don't know him so much. He's really a kind of iconic figure in Britain, one of the great gay poets, thinkers, filmmakers, voice of sanity and goodness. And he did this film as he was dying of AIDS. And it's just 75 minutes of a beautifully saturated blue screen. At one point they were supposed to run some visuals here, but never got run, but it doesn't matter. But one is that. These are all in the book, so you don't have to buy the book, but you can look through it. I mean, the pictures are great. And then they're just voices over the screen of people he knew and things he had written. And it's the most unforgettable and yet also unwatchable movie I've ever seen. It's the most moving movie I've ever seen, and yet it's not exactly a motion picture. I mean, it's just this field of blue. And I use those three artists to kind of stress exactly what you asked about. What is the relationship of those two things? It's a wonderful question. And is that really the last? I thank you all so much for coming. And
Thank you
being
very
so
much.
attentive. And I thank Ellen for being the best interlocutor.
So, thank you all, and on your way out, there will be a book signing.